Do you ever wonder what's lurking below dark, deep bodies of water? It turns out this is the perfect dumping ground for hiding things that you never want anyone to find. But not all things can stay a secret forever. Hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Kimbyrleigha. If you've never been here before, nice to meet you. Just so you know, the last video was actually part one of this video. Here's the thing. You do not have to go back and watch part one if you don't want to, and I'll explain why. That video, though, goes into depth about Wayne's mother, his childhood, his mental health, and I do find it very informative, especially if you do enjoy deep dives into the mind of a killer. But if you want to jump right in and learn about the murders, or maybe go back later after you hear what happened and learn more about Wayne, I would highly recommend it either way. But I've put a lot into this case, and I'm gonna briefly recap what we learned in part one and then get into the stories about the victims. This video is intended for educational and documentary purposes. The content within this video contains themes that some individuals may consider triggering, offensive, or disturbing. The intent is not to disrespect viewers or any individual spoken about herein. Viewer discretion is advised. If you want to skip the recap, just go to the timestamp right here. I'm going to also link it below in the description box so you can go right to the next victim. Today's story is about Wayne Adam Ford. Wayne was born on the 3rd of December 1961 in Petaluma, California. Wayne's father's name was Calvin Eugene Ford, but he went by the name Gene. His father was American, and his mother, Karen Bridget Danziger, was German, and they met in Germany when Gene was stationed there in 1957. Karen was also very concerned with her looks. So much so, when she got pregnant with her first child, Wayne's older brother Rodney, she didn't want to get fat. She put herself on a restrictive diet. She only ate 900 calories a day when she was pregnant, and by the time she gave birth to Rodney, she was anorexic. She never wanted to be a mother. She had no motherly instincts, and she lacked the ability to connect. She didn't know how to nurture her children, and after having Rodney, she swore she would never get pregnant again. She didn't want to have more children, so of course she went on birth control. But her husband says he doesn't recall that ever happening. Karen claims that less than 2 years later, one night her and Gene got into a heated argument and he forced himself on her. That night she happened to be off the pill and it caused her to get pregnant with Wayne. I don't know whether to believe the story. I wasn't there. I don't know. Maybe this was to make herself feel better because she broke a promise to herself and now she's having a second child when she knows she's not the best mother. Maybe she thought having another child would change her. Maybe she had good intentions, but then later on she wanted to blame it on someone else because of what happens. What's even worse about this situation is that she goes on to tell her own son, Wayne, that he was a product of rape. Can you imagine your own mother telling you that? As if she doesn't want you and all she can remember about when you were conceived is being horrified and not wanting to have sex with your own father. Karen never hid the fact, she didn't even try, that she didn't love Wayne. She didn't even watch him to make sure he didn't hurt himself. It's like she just wanted him to disappear, even if it meant he would die. When Wayne was just 2 years old and he ends up falling down a stairwell, she's not watching him. She's leaving him unattended and he hits his head so bad that he sustains a major head injury. Child abuse? I don't know. Tell me what you think. He had to get multiple stitches and he had to be monitored because they didn't want him to have a concussion. In the end, they did discharge him from the hospital and said there could be long-term damage, but that there shouldn't be. Wayne and his brother Rodney were close when they were growing up. Of course, Wayne was happy when Gene was away from the military. He was almost never home. So this left Rodney to step in as a father. And it would be fun to have your brother as your father figure because, you know, he's cool. You can get along with him. He doesn't hit you. And really, Rodney became his best friend and he was completely loyal to Rodney. And he wanted to know, is Rodney loyal to me though? So Wayne started to test Rodney to see how far his loyalty went. So Wayne decides to leave the house in the middle of the night one night. He goes to a hardware store, he breaks in, and he steals a bunch of different items, just random items. The next day, Rodney reads about this in the local newspaper, and Wayne just openly confesses to him what he did. This was a test, remember that. Of course, Rodney says, "Why did you do that?" And Wayne just responds because he thought it was something fun to do, and he enjoyed outsmarting authorities. The other thing is, Wayne knew better than to trust Rodney with this kind of secret, because Rodney was a daddy's boy and quickly went and told their father. This brought down a severe punishment on Wayne. He thought he was smart enough to avoid that, but he wasn't, and Gene essentially beat him up. Despite being scared of his father and his fragile personality, Wayne continued to commit petty crimes. He was arrested for assaulting sex workers. He was arrested for cruelty to animals, and also oral sex with someone underage when he was only 17. He stole cars, and you know what? His dad had had enough. So at this point, he forces Wayne to drop out of school and join the Marines. And it seemed like a perfect solution. And it kind of was, because he started to do really well. He served 6 years. And then he was honorably, not dishonorably, honorably discharged, even though he had multiple violations and write-ups. And he was released from his duties in 1985. But at 19 years old, something terrible ends up happening to Wayne. Wayne was dating a girl named Kelly, and they were out on a date. It was the fall of 1980. Wayne was driving from their date, and he sees a bad accident on the side of the road. He pulls over to investigate what happened and help the driver, because he can see the guy is bleeding profusely, obviously in need of medical care. But when Wayne was kneeling down at the driver's side of the car trying to stop the bleeding, he was hit by a drunk driver. This man was thrown more than 40 feet into the air, and then he landed in an embankment. He broke part of his jaw off, and for over a week, no one thought he was going to survive this. It caused drastic changes in his personality. He became murderous. He was violent. He had these uncontrollable urges. And this can happen in people who have frontal lobe damage, because this is the part of the brain that's considered the part that controls your personality. But the following year, Wayne, still in his relationship, decides it's a great time to propose to Kelly, and she says yes. They elope in Vegas, and he's only 20. Their relationship started out fine. Their marriage was okay. But after this injury, Wayne progressively started to get worse. His behavior was too much, but specifically, Kelly could not accommodate his sexual urges anymore. Wayne became obsessively fascinated with Kelly's breasts. It even went so far as requesting more and more from her in the bedroom. And he's got this fixation on her boobs, and it just started to grow and grow. And at one point, he tries to convince her to let him make a wax mold. He wants her to dip her breasts in wax, in hot wax, and then make a mold that he could cherish and worship and use later to satisfy himself when she wasn't around. Because it stemmed from his preference that she just cover her face when they were having sex, so that only her boobs were showing. Like, he would cover all of her body and only have her boobs showing. And he just wanted to pleasure himself that way. And she finally decided she was going to leave Wayne. And this happened after she went out with friends one night. When she came home, he was hiding in the bushes with a compound bow. I'm going to show you one. He planned on shooting her. Shooting her. Why? Because he was convinced, like a lot of abusers are, that she was cheating on him. And she tells Wayne, it's over. But that nightmare was not over, because for weeks, he would stalk her. Even though she moved multiple times, she would get a bunch of calls at work. He would tell her on the phone everything she did that day, because he was everywhere stalking her. He knew everywhere she had been. So about a year later, he decides to go back into the military. His disorders were getting too much to handle, though, and he was detained for assaulting an officer. They decide to have him evaluated at this time. But if you want to know his final diagnosis, borderline personality disorder. And he had no support. Once he was discharged, he didn't know where to go. He didn't know how to access mental health care. And his brother was busy starting his own family. Wayne had no other choice but to move in with his uncle Billy, who ends up getting him a job as a truck driver, which he hated because Wayne thought he was meant for much bigger things. But for about 6 years, Wayne is left to his own devices. And during this time, when he was 25, he ends up meeting a woman from Kuwait named Wadad Radwan. She was in her late teens, and she was working the customer service desk at the trucking company that he worked for. Here, we can see his sexual preferences deviate from the norm even more in this relationship. Get ready for this because it's intense. He started to prick her nipples with needles. He wouldn't push them all the way through the skin. He would stop, especially if she complained about pain. And the roommate's cousin comes over one night to stay over. And Wayne walks outside, and in the dark, he is staring through the window at the cousin sleeping on the bed. He actually admits this to Wadad. Why does he do this? It's kind of like admitting what he did to Rodney. It's like he wants to get in trouble. But he tells Wadad, I saw her laying on the bed naked. And he's almost just like having this moment where he's turned on by it. And they break up. And this is what brings the brothers back together. They start hanging out, going on trips, even with Rodney's kids. They're sharing mutual friends. They're four-wheeling. They're hiking, camping, just doing brotherly things together. And at this point, Wayne actually seems pretty stable. He meets another woman. Her name is Elizabeth. They meet at a bar, and eventually he ends up getting married to Elizabeth. Elizabeth eventually gets pregnant. He began his pricking impulses again. He would poke her with safety pins. And you know where, you could probably guess, yes, in the nipples. And things started to get harder and harder for Elizabeth to deal with. She gives birth to their son, Max. Eventually, she'd had enough. She broke down and she left him. But this hurt Wayne in a different way than when Kelly left him, because now he was losing his wife and he was losing his son. And this moment begins to shape the rest of his entire life. So to ease his pain, he meets up with some friends at a bar, and while he's drunk, he tells one of them that he hates women, especially his ex, because she ruined his life. And I think most of us can agree, though we've said something similar. When someone hurts us, we say things we don't mean. But then he went on to add he wants to kill women, chop them up, and hide them so they would never be identified. That is very gross. That is not normal. But of course, his friends didn't take him seriously. Why not? He gets a job at a cement company. He moves into a trailer park that's right near his aunt's house. And he really feels like his life is falling apart. And this is when the killing begins. Wayne goes on a murder spree. It was the fall of 1997. It was in late October. Wayne was driving when he sees a woman hitchhiking near Eureka, California. He couldn't help but notice her large boobs, and he immediately pulls over to talk to her. She was troubled, she was on drugs, and she says that she needs a ride to the beach. He agrees, so she gets in his car. As he's driving, he keeps staring over at her, and he can't stop staring at her boobs. He just has this uncontrollable urge to touch them. It was overwhelming, and instead of dropping her off at the beach, he convinces her to come back to his trailer because he says, I'm going to give you some money so you can get back on your feet, which, by the way, he says he truly intended to do, but his urge was too strong, and he attempted to get her to sleep with him, but she denied him. He forced himself on her, and he was being rough. He liked that she wasn't fighting him anymore at one point, and she was letting him do whatever he needed to. But all of a sudden, he notices that she's just lying there. She's just completely still. And that's when he is shocked to find out she's not breathing. And he looks down and his hands are around her neck. He doesn't know what to do. He doesn't know at this point, according to him, if this was a heart attack or if he had hurt her in some way, and he panics. All the while, he's sitting here thinking that he's making her feel good, and apparently it went too far. So he doesn't know how long this went on after she was deceased, but now he has to get rid of her. He thinks that dismembering her would be best, so he picks her up, he places her in his bathtub, and he gets to work. But then when it comes to discarding her body, he's looking at all the parts, and he couldn't help himself. He became enraged. He was upset about wasting her breasts. So he decides to keep them. Guys, he's keeping her breasts. It's kind of like when he wanted to do the mold of Kelly's so he could like use them later to please himself. It's so disgusting. I want to vomit, but there's more. He decides, I gotta take a minute. He decides to cook them. He cooks them in the oven and they are sizzling and baking, and then he takes them out and he stores them in a coffee can in his cupboard. Oh my God. And he was like, why stop there? He decides to freeze a few of the other limbs, thinking, maybe he'll cook them later. Who knows? He doesn't know what he's going to do with them, but he places them into his freezer next to his ice cream, his frozen dinners. It's like macaroni and cheese, a hand, Marie Callender's Feast for One, a foot. It's not funny. It's disgusting, and it's the truth, and that's what's so bad. I'm not going to go into complete detail with other parts of her body that he decided to mutilate and cut up because it's just too much. But this leads to this new fascination. It's this new addiction of being sexual in a new way. Just a few days later, on the 26th of October in 1997, during a canoe trip down Eureka's Orion Slough, something that appeared to be a mannequin was spotted on a muddy bank by a group of duck hunters and photographers that were with them. And it was the remains of the girl that Wayne had been with. She was missing her head, her arms, and her legs. The most notable and horrific part of this discovery was the severed breasts. The body was examined by the county coroner, but it could never be identified, so it was given the name Torso Girl, which I personally find very insensitive, but I suppose that was what was left over. According to the coroner, she was between the ages of 18 and 25, had a dark complexion, and was most likely Hispanic. They also could tell she had previously given birth and she had been deceased for at least 3 days before she was found. It wasn't until 3 months later that 2 people that were cutting driftwood at the beach pulled a dried out, sunburned left arm from debris that had washed up on shore, and the DNA matched the torso, but a DNA match to an actual person in a database was never found. At this point, Wayne gets a job as a long-haul trucker, which makes it really easy for him to carry out these heinous crimes because he's moving from one place to the next, and it's easy for him to just leave before anyone can suspect him. Plus, he's got a 45-foot flatbed that has a sleeping area, or a killing area. Now, the next victim hits close to home, not just because she was killed here in LA, and I live here, but because of where the body was found. Let me explain, because you know I will. California residents here in LA get their water for, baths, the tap water, some people even drink it, from a system called an aqueduct. And it consists of canals and tunnels and pipelines, and it brings in water that's been collected from the Sierra Nevada mountains. These aqueducts are 400 miles long. They're 32 feet deep at the deepest points, and they're about 110 feet across at their widest points. Many deaths actually occur from people drowning. And this takes place, and I don't know how, by accident when people fall in, because it's got this calm, eerie water that's very inviting, and then you just can't get out.
Body has been found on the California Aqueduct near Huron.
The aqueduct's currents are dangerously unpredictable, and if you fell in, you could easily drown. The best way to avoid drowning in the California Aqueduct is to totally stay away.
A 9-year-old boy who said that he and his father were riding alongside the aqueduct when he lost control of his bicycle and he fell in. The father then jumped into the water and saved the boy, but the father went under and he did not resurface.
It is a scary place. It can take your life at any time.
In the past 5 years, 14 people have drowned in the aqueduct that passes through San Bernardino County's Victor Valley in the high desert. In the past 11 years, 125 people statewide have died by drowning in the 444-mile-long aqueduct.
Now, here's something I didn't know, but since the 1960s, it's been known for hiding the decomposing bodies of infants and adults. And the thought of drinking water ever again, even treated water, from there makes me gag. Tina Renee Gibbs was an attractive woman, but she had trouble in her dating life. I mean, who doesn't? But her trouble in life dated back to when she was a kid. And she was now at this point estranged from her mother, but growing up, she had a really close relationship with her. They were almost best friends until she started hanging out with the wrong crowd and the wrong men. It happens. Tina's mother was desperate. She would fight so hard to keep Tina on the right track. But then Tina started to use drugs. And to fund that habit, she started to sell her body, which is completely tragic. It had been about a year since the last body was found, and Wayne was driving his truck through Vegas. He sees Tina, who's working at the moment, and she gets in with him. He takes her to the back of the truck with that sleeping compartment and he begins to have sex with her. And while he's doing it, he remembers what it was like when his last victim was lying completely still. It could have been subconscious, but he begins to put his hands around her neck until she passes out. She's as still as a corpse, and then he revives her with CPR and does it again and again and again while repeatedly violating her. And then finally, she dies. He keeps her corpse in his truck for days. And then he decides to dispose of it in the California aqueduct. Tina's body was discovered floating in the water of the aqueduct near the town of Buttonwillow. It was on June 2nd, 1998. The body was then transferred to the Kern County Coroner's Office for inspection. Construction workers had actually found her body because they spotted a naked woman, face down, extremely bloated, and it looked like she had been there for a long time. And she wasn't easily identified. They had to do special techniques to get her fingerprints, and there were obvious signs of foul play. During the exam, it was revealed that she died as a result of the manual asphyxiation. She had bruises on the left side of her jaw and this triangular mark under her neck, and then bruises to the right side of her neck, as well as scrape marks on her temple and her chin. This makes me believe she was fighting for her life. She was trying to get away, and then her neck was broken. And it had a circular mark around it that looked like she had been choked with a rope or a belt, which we know he's done before. It actually took them until July of that year to identify her. She was 26 years old at the time of her death, and when her mother learned about what happened, obviously she was devastated. But she couldn't handle it, and she was hospitalized 5 times due to the mental agony that she was dealing with, and she became medically handicapped. She was not able to work ever again. I have to pause because I want to talk about necrophilia. You've probably heard of it before, but it is a sexual attraction to the dead. Professionals that have investigated this case say that this is the real reason that Wayne did what he did. There are motivations for necrophilia: low self-esteem, the desire for complete control over an unresisting partner, a socially isolated individual that feels comfort in this act because they're close to someone that won't reject them, and they could be suffering from uncontrollable lust. We know he liked women that did not resist, so I think that's why he preferred them to be deceased. Just a month later in August, Wayne spotted another sex worker he thought was beautiful. Her name is Rachel Holt. Now, I know I've talked about some really horrific things thus far, but what you're about to hear is worse. She went through some of the worst things I have ever heard. I read a lot of true crime cases and I research a lot during my classes. This is one of the worst stories of torture that I've heard, because we usually don't know exactly what happened, but this woman lived through this. So she's able to tell everyone what she went through. Hearing these things are going to show you just how much he tortured these poor women. Wayne offers her $100 in exchange for sexual favors, and they end up trying to have sex, but Wayne just can't perform. He tries and he tries, he gets nervous, he seems paranoid, and she's actually really kind to him. This is her client. She tries to get him to relax. She's trying to do everything to make him comfortable so he can get what he paid for. That's when he starts to grab her breasts, and he does it really hard. And she tells him, listen, that's fine, but can you be less aggressive? So he apologizes, but then he's not stopping. She starts to get a gut feeling that this is a dangerous situation, but he still can't perform. They tried a lot of different positions, and then all of a sudden, he forces her hands behind her back and he ties them together. This wasn't okay with her because she did not agree to S&M, and she starts to panic. Rachel's yelling and screaming and telling him to stop, and he tells her, if you don't shut up, I'm gonna kill you. She's crying uncontrollably, and he just keeps telling her to shut up. So she stops fighting with him. She lets him do whatever he wants. She's still crying, but she gave up the fight. He demands that she bites his nipples. He puts a rope around her neck and in her mouth, and he tells her to jack him off while pinching and biting his nipples. She notices that when she acts like she's turned on, he liked it. So she has to pretend she's enjoying it. This may have saved her life. He wants to move to a different location, but he doesn't want her to escape. So he ties her up so she couldn't move. And if she tried to, she would end up choking herself. He drove the truck somewhere else and told her not to scream or make any noise or he would kill her. All the while, when she has to be quiet, he continues to punch her in the genitals, hit her with a leather belt, and drink his coffee in between. He finally pulls over, and she's worried about the circulation in her hands. And she asks him, are my hands okay? And he says they were, but he still unties her, and he puts her in the bed again. He can finally perform. Yay for Wayne. He forces himself on her. He gags her, blindfolds her, and then he would tighten this ligature around her neck until she was unconscious. He would give her CPR to wake her up, and then he would do it again, and he did it 5 more times that she could remember. She recounts giving him oral again and again and again, and then he penetrated her anally. Turn back now if this has already been triggering, because what he does next is something I can't even handle. I'm going to give you a moment here. He lights a match and he burns her vagina until it is completely blistered over. This woman is forever deformed, and he tells her that this was one of his fantasies, to burn a woman's genitals. And this torture lasted for hours. And at one point, she had to go to the bathroom. And he made her do it in an empty baby wipe container. Seriously, these women weren't even human beings to him. Out of nowhere, he stopped. He lets her get dressed. And he's acting normal, I guess for him, and calm. And he starts a conversation with her. He even apologized for what he had just done to her. And she asks him why he was doing this. He whips out not his ding-dong, but a picture of Elizabeth. And he goes on to explain how she ruined his life, that she cheated on him, took their son away, and now he was getting revenge. As he was explaining this, he was breaking down and crying, and this woman actually offers him a hug. Because Rachel was so kind to him, he told her he was going to let her go, and he did. When she was getting out of his truck, he actually helped her put her jacket on. He pulled the hood over her head, and he tightened it, and he told her, please stay warm, because he didn't want her to get sick. It was cold out and rainy. That's insane. This just shows you how he can just switch back and forth. When the police picked her up, they performed a rape kit on her at the hospital, and the nurse said out of 175 rape victims that she had treated, Rachel was the most badly injured, and the exam took 4 hours to complete because it was so painful for her. The DNA was later matched to Wayne, so we know, not that she would lie about this, but we know this really happened and that he did this. She had swelling all over her neck, her face. She had a cut lip. She had the same like circular marks and swelling around her neck and her wrists. She had rope burns on her ankles, abrasions on her inner and outer labia, and burns there as well. My friends, these are the women that we know about. But since he targeted very vulnerable people, sex workers, drug addicts, many of them have never come forward. And later when we hear that interview with him, he will tell you just how many he thinks there were. Another woman was paid $40 to sit in his truck while he masturbated, and she performed oral sex on him. Once she was inside the sleeper, he tied her arms behind her back and then another around her neck, and took another rope and bound her wrists and ankles together with her knees to her chest. He gagged her, he burned her breasts and her vagina with a cigarette lighter, he poked her genitals with some kind of sharp instrument, and he sat on her face until she couldn't breathe. He continuously raped her. He choked her out 4 times and brought her back with CPR. Then he stole the money that he had given her. He stole the money back, dropped her off on the side of the road. I can't even imagine. Another woman that had come forward was Valerie Rondi. She was hitchhiking and Wayne offered her a ride and asked her how much for sex, and she said $60. He drove her to his grandmother's house, and while they had sex, she pinched his nipples. When it was over, he wanted to talk. And they talked about everything. They talked about his childhood, his parents, his ex-wife, and he ends up showing off his truck. At this point, he asks her if she wants to go on a road trip just for a day, and that he'd bring her back later on. She actually agreed, as long as they would be back right away because she was addicted to heroin. She only had enough to hold her over for 1 day until she would start to experience very bad withdrawal symptoms that would make her really sick. He promised he would have her back, and as they drove, he talked the entire time, telling her about his life story and even making things up, saying that his first wife was a famous actress in LA. He tried to sleep with her, but she told him, no, you're not gonna get that for free. So instead, he just went to his bed and he masturbated. Then she realized they weren't gonna be back the next day like he had promised. She starts freaking out.
When I realized that we weren't coming back to Humboldt County, that he was going to, he said our next stop is Vegas.
She's begging Wayne to please take her home. She needed her fix and was already feeling sick. But then again, he promised her he's gonna get her some. He said he was lonely and he was begging her to stay with him. He asked for sex again that night, but she was actually really sick. And she was so sick, she couldn't even comply, even if he was going to pay her. At this point, he's screaming at her. He's degrading her, he's saying mean things to her, and she starts getting really scared. But she kept quiet, and he went to bed, and he just pleasured himself again. The next day, she actually apologized to him, mostly because she was scared for her life. And now, she decided to comply. She was sitting there. As he was driving at this point, she looks over and he is just downing beers. She starts to count and he ends up drinking 18 beers. All the while, she's sitting there physically ill, throwing up, not feeling good. And it had been almost a week now. They were supposed to be gone for a day. That night, she decided to do whatever he wanted because she had to leave. So she ends up sleeping with him.
He forced himself on me. I was too weak.
And he asked her once again to pinch his nipples. They went to sleep, and the next day, she was so sick, She couldn't stop vomiting over and over again. So finally he agreed to take her to another truck stop and to pretty much pawn her off on another trucker. A nice man, another trucker, decided to take her home.
And I ran over to that other truck and I jumped up there and I asked him to please help me.
And a few days later, Wayne actually calls her. I guess they exchanged numbers. He does this to find out if she made it home okay. Obviously, she hangs up on his crazy ass. Thing is, he was so transient, it was almost impossible for police to track him down or even know that he was the one committing these crimes. The type of victims he chose were also reluctant to come forward in fear of being arrested, because what they were doing was illegal, and sometimes they just wanted to forget about it and move on. His next victim wasn't lucky enough to be here to tell her story herself, so I'm going to tell it for you. Lynette White was a 25-year-old mother of 4. Her oldest daughter was 10 years old and her name was Amanda. Her cousin Mario was over visiting the night she disappeared. He last saw her September 20th at around 10 p.m. as she prepared to go to the grocery store to buy milk for her baby. When she didn't come home, her friends and her family started to get concerned, but the possibility that she had been murdered didn't even cross their minds. Mario said before leaving the house, she threw on a pair of heels, tight faded denim jeans, a blue crop top, and a brown flannel shirt. She'd also been crying, but Mario didn't ask why. It wasn't his business. And then about an hour went by, and that's when he became concerned. But he knew her very well, and sometimes she would get off track because she did have a drug addiction and she would end up at a friend's house. But by 2 a.m., and she wasn't back, Mario picked up the baby and drove around the neighborhood looking for her. Nobody knew what could have happened to Lynette except for Wayne. Here's Wayne's account of what happened. He said he saw Lynette Sunday the 20th, the night she disappeared, and that she was near a truck stop. She was upset and crying. She had been drinking, and she gets into his truck. They proceeded to talk about their life, about their children, and here he is making it sound like he cared about these girls, and it's sick either way. But he says the next thing he knows, they're just having sex, and I doubt that's how it went. He ends up putting his hands around her neck and did the whole pass out CPR thing, but she doesn't wake up. 5 days later, Lynette's naked body was discovered in an irrigation ditch off of the side of the freeway in California. They found several items where she was discovered, including women's clothing that matched what she was wearing that night, also a bloody sheet, some hair, a white plastic bag, and on the bag was the logo for a truck stop. It's called Flying J, and there was also some jewelry. Investigators believed that the evidence would help them figure out who the victim was and how she died. Poor Lynette. She stopped into Flying J for milk for her baby. She bumps into Wayne. Her poor kids. Due to the advanced level of decomposition, the autopsy revealed that Lynette had been deceased for several days. There was a puncture mark on one of her breasts and signs of suffocation. Investigators also believe that she was murdered somewhere else and then actually thrown from a moving vehicle into the ditch. Just a month later, Wayne strikes once again. The victim's name is Patricia Ann Tamez. She was a 29-year-old woman who had a very hard life. And at the time, she was sadly struggling with an eating disorder, and she started experimenting with diet pills. And this was a gateway into other drugs: heroin, LSD, PCP. She was addicted to meth, cocaine, alcohol, and the pattern with these women in the story is drugs and living that hard life. This could happen to anyone. I know you might not believe that, but it really can happen to anyone. Drug addiction can be progressive, and it's not something you usually plan on getting into. Patricia was using sex work to fund her addiction, and she spent the early morning hours of October 22nd, 1998, proposing sex to truck drivers, and this was in Victorville, California. After a few hours, Wayne drove up, and she got a positive response from him, so she jumps into his vehicle. After this, she was never seen again, and only Wayne knows exactly what happened the night because he claims, once again, he wasn't trying to kill anyone. He was only trying to give them erotic asphyxia and pleasure. And in case you don't know, this is when an orgasm is intensified from the lack of oxygen, when someone presses on the carotid artery. And he says in these cases where the women end up dead, it was by accident, and that this just went too far, that they wanted this. And then he became upset every time this would happen, and he would start to cry. I'm sorry, but this guy was sitting there burning them with lighters, choking them, hitting them with belts, and torturing them. And he keeps saying this was for their pleasure. Okay, to be fair, some people may like it, I get it, but I don't think any of these women asked for this. I think he's a liar, and I think he feels dirty after he commits these crimes, only to go back and do it again. And we all know it was for his pleasure. He proceeds to drive 7 hours with her body in the back of his truck. And then he just shows up on a whim at Rodney's house. Rodney found this to be really unusual because he was going out of his way uninvited. But of course, Rodney invites him in, they have a bite to eat, and then Wayne just keeps on insisting that Rodney come outside and go look at his truck. He wants to show off this sleeping area and how cool his truck is and how big it is. And Rodney's like, no, I don't want to see your truck. And Rodney thinks it's weird that his brother keeps asking him. But then I was thinking, since we know what happens, maybe this was like his past. He wanted to tell his brother maybe without telling him, because like the old days he knew, Rodney always told the truth. And maybe he was looking for help and wanted his brother to turn him in. So here is yet another time he could have been stopped. But can you imagine if Rodney had looked? Oh my God, that would be so scary. But he didn't. He didn't. So Wayne left and just got rid of the body. Honestly, do you think this was a cry for help? I don't always think these people really want to hurt others, and I know many of you will completely disagree, but really think about it. Many of these people know that they have issues, and he specifically had tried to get help not too long before this started to get worse. I think it's hard to pinpoint and then admit that you have these urges. Many serial killers have families and stable relationships with their partners, only to be doing this on the side. And I know people will conclude that they're just psychopaths, but to me, there are two distinct sides to some of these men. I don't think it's just a facade. I truly think they can love people, and they do. I think they love their children at times and their family, and they would kill anyone who tried to hurt them, yet they're out also killing and hurting other people's wives, other people's children, so it clearly makes no sense. The very next day, 2 security officers are on duty at the California Aqueduct again, and they see something floating in the waves near this pump house. They realize that the floating object is Patricia's naked body, and they dial 911. When the investigators arrive at the scene, they pull her remains from the water, and they're shocked to see that one of her breasts has been severed completely off. It was clear this was a deliberate killing, and the autopsy ends up indicating that Patricia had been subjected to significant trauma before her death. She'd been chained, she'd been beaten on the head with a blunt weapon, raped, and according to the evidence, whoever did this to her also damaged her spine and had actually severed the breast before she was strangled to death. This wasn't done after she couldn't feel anything. Hemorrhages were found in her eyes, her face, and her upper lip. This is called petechiae, and this shows the lack of oxygen. It shows strangulation. Some of the bindings were tied when she was on the brink of death, probably suffocating and fighting for her life. She had a wound on her head and on her nose, and her brain was swollen. Her neck was bleeding from the inside. There was blood in the center of her back was broken, and she would have been paralyzed at least from the midsection down. No drugs were found in her body. When they went to go search the area upstream from the aqueduct, they found materials likely related to the murder. They found a bloodied towel, shirt, jeans, a .22 caliber, and police were unable to find the victim's missing breast. And they literally had no leads on who this perpetrator was. However, police caught a significant break in this investigation just a few weeks later. Wayne was in a downward spiral. he was starting to frequent a Christian bookstore, and he actually makes friends with one of the employees. He confides in this employee and said that he had done some really bad things and doesn't think he has a conscience. The employee convinces him to buy this box set of cassette tapes. I don't know if you're familiar with what those are. Depending on your age, you will or will not know. Most likely he would listen to this while he was driving his truck, and it was just the Bible in audio form. I told you, I think he feels dirty and guilty afterward, just like an addiction. Maybe you drink one night and you go out, you get hammered, and then you're like, I hated the way I act. I hated the way I felt the next day. But then you do it again. And at one point, he definitely was out of his mind because he's in a grocery store. This woman is checking his ID so that he can buy beer. And he said, remember that face? Because it's the face of a serial killer. And he also admitted to her that he loved to kill women. She didn't believe him because why would somebody say something like that? But on November 2nd, just a few weeks after police found Patricia, he's at a bar getting drunk once again, playing pool and talking to a bartender about how he wants to go get a gun, put it to his head, and end himself. But instead of doing this, probably because he was a coward, Wayne goes over to a payphone. He's in Trinidad, California, and he calls his good old brother Rodney. Rodney recalls Wayne was incoherent. He was rambling. He wasn't making any sense. He told Rodney that he had done really bad things. He had hurt a bunch of people. He didn't want to hurt anyone else. He told Rodney to come up to this lodge in the woods that he had been staying at. At this point, Wayne is just overcome by emotion. He's crying, and Rodney had never heard him this upset, and of course he wants to help. However, he's refusing to tell Rodney details about what was wrong. His brother leaves and drives over 6 hours to meet Wayne, and he gets there at 1 a.m., and Wayne is physically and mentally distraught. Rodney doesn't even recognize him. I mean, the person that stood before him was Wayne, and he knew that. It just looked like there was something really wrong with him. He had been living in the woods for days. He wasn't taking care of himself. He smelled disgusting, like he had actually peed himself, not changed out of his clothes, his hair was matted. And instead of telling Rodney what in the world was going on, he starts just babbling about why their father didn't treat them well and asking questions about why they were abandoned by their mother. And this is a classic borderline trait. It's that rejection. It's that fear that nobody loves you. And he even says he doesn't know why people don't love him or care about him. And his brother responded with, I love you. I care about you, and that's why I'm here. It was obvious from what Wayne admitted to Rodney that he had hurt them severely and fatally. Rodney couldn't believe that. It was surreal. It felt like he was having an out-of-body experience. He didn't know what he was hearing. He wasn't really taking it in, and he didn't think this could be real. He thought that Wayne was delusional. He thought that maybe he was high on drugs and that maybe he did something, but it wasn't that drastic. Rodney says, all right, you gotta shower, you gotta get dressed, you gotta sleep. And then in the morning, we'll figure it out and we'll go to the police department. But the next morning, it was like nothing happened. Wayne looked like his normal self. He was feeling good, he was happy, they were eating breakfast together. And then Wayne wanted to do a few things before turning himself in, which makes sense. I really think he knew this was gonna be the last time he saw the light of day. So he asked his brother to drive around to where they grew up as kids. He wanted to pass by the zoo. He wanted to go near their uncle's old house. He wanted to drive around town and go to Arizona. And he wanted to even go to see a movie, but Rodney said, no, we're gonna go to the police right now. At first I was kind of surprised that he would let Rodney turn him in. But Rodney said, no, Wayne knew that he would. There was no way Rodney wouldn't have turned him in. And that also makes me believe there were two sides to Wayne. All afternoon, Rodney spent time trying to get Wayne to give up information, but he was unsuccessful. Ultimately, he determined that if Wayne had done something that caused other people harm, even death, he had no choice but to surrender himself to the police. Wayne seemed to be filled with remorse. He followed his brother's suggestion, and they went to the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department that same night. Wayne Adam Ford stepped into the Humboldt County Sheriff's Department in Eureka, California on November 3rd, 1998. He was accompanied by his brother Rodney. Wayne absolutely astounded the agents because shortly after he arrived at the department, he broke down sobbing and confessed to murdering 4 women. The police thought he was crazy. They didn't believe him. They thought he was a mental case. He was rambling, he wasn't making sense, he was just crying and acting upset, and they thought maybe he needed to go to the psych ward. They kept saying, they don't have any proof. Yeah, you're admitting to this, but what proof do you have? So Wayne says, oh, I have proof. And this disgusted me. It is so nasty. Can you guess? His demeanor flipped. He went to reach into his pocket, and of course, the officer pointed a gun at him and said, put your hands up, don't move. Wayne said, I'm not trying to hurt anyone. Just go in my pocket and pull out the bag that's in there, and you will have all the proof that you need. The officer goes over, and he won't forget this. When he was being interviewed and I heard this, this is something no one will ever forget. And that's why I said, this story will probably scar you. The officer reaches into his pocket and pulls out a baggie, and in it is what looked like raw chicken breast, but upon further investigation, it was a woman's severed breast, and they later found out it was Patricia's. And at this point, they knew it was true. This type of situation does so much damage to so many people involved, not just the victims and their families, but also the families of the killer. And a lot of people don't think of that, but it is true. Rodney had to move. There was all this media at his door, beating on his door, scaring his wife and his 2 babies, and the pressures were too great. Whether someone in your family is guilty or not, you still feel that pain. Plus, it's totally unexpected. You can't plan for this. And it pales in comparison to losing your family member at the hands of a callous killer. But the killer's family also loses. They do. They lose the ability to truly experience their loved one's life ever again. Even if their body is still alive and they're still living and breathing, they don't get the opportunity to experience that person's life. The police said if it wasn't for Rodney, they don't think these crimes would have ever been solved. When the authorities start to take a closer look at all these murders, they realize that if Wayne felt any guilt at all, he would have never tortured these women the way that he did. All the tears and the remorse that he said he felt were a total facade. They were clearly dealing with a wicked man who had little to no concern for human life, and the police also understood that if he hadn't turned himself in, he would have kept killing. What do you think? Do you think he would have continued? Do you think he was really guilty? Wayne disclosed the location of some of the body parts of the unidentified woman that he had killed. He claimed he buried the woman's head and arms close to the Mad River. The victim's remaining body parts, including her thighs, were stored in his freezer. And then later he took them out and buried them in a campground. So to confirm this story, investigators went to the campground and to the Mad River, but they were unable to locate the victim's head, no matter what they did, and this reduced the chances of her ever being identified. They did, however, discover 6 or 7 more body pieces associated to Jane Doe, the torso girl, at the campground. Can you guess what they discovered when they did a search of his trailer? The coffee container in the kitchen. We know what's in there. I don't think we have to go into that again. There was also a plastic bag that had the same Flying J logo that matched the bag that they found next to Lynette White's body. The freezer where Wayne kept the body parts was confiscated, and the evidence from the trailer and the campground were all transferred to a police lab to be investigated. These crimes were carried out in 4 separate jurisdictions, but Wayne was the very first defendant to face prosecution under California's new serial killer single trial law. Any of the jurisdictions could decide to take over for all the crimes committed in all jurisdictions. They had to analyze Wayne to know if he was fit to stand trial, so the doctors that analyzed him said that he was suffering from a number of paraphilia sexual deviations. The first one is called picarism. It's poking body parts with a needle, and for him, it was the breast. And because it was one section of the body, this is known as partialism, and it's when you focus on one body part for sexual arousal. He was also an ephebophile, and this is a person who's primarily attracted to women that look like they went through puberty, but still have some childish characteristics. He was also a killer that committed crimes of organized lust, or erotophonophilia. He also had isolated incidents of pseudo-necrophilia, which I already defined. And when we say pseudo, it means that sometimes they weren't actually deceased because they were just unconscious. But it seemed like they were deceased to him, so he could have been a necrophiliac too, but we don't know. Wayne suffered with periods of acute psychosis when he was in the military and they put him on meds to calm him down. He had also been described as catatonic, So they scanned his brain. You know what they found? Atrophy. Where? In the cerebellum. Something was wrong structurally with his brain, whether it was from alcohol or something else. In June of 1999 in San Bernardino, California, he was charged with 4 counts of murder. This was 7 years after the case went to trial, and this delay was because of a series of motions from both the defense and the prosecution. So it wasn't until June of 2006 that Wayne Adam Ford was found guilty of 4 counts of murder. The defense was against the death penalty, but Wayne said he wanted to be put to death. In March 2006, the trial began, and by June 27th, the jury found him guilty on all 4 counts of first-degree murder for the deaths of Tina Gibbs, Patricia Tomaz, Lynette White, and Jane Doe, the torso girl. He was sentenced to death in August of 2006, and he remains on death row at the San Quentin State Prison to this day. However, that doesn't stop him from having females around, and you'll find out why right now. I want you to hear from Wayne himself. This is an interview with Laura Brand, who inspired me to go back to school to become a death investigator. She's well known for getting serial killers to open up to her. Her most publicized interview was with the toolbox killer, Lawrence Bittaker. I'll leave all of her social media links in my description box. You have to check her out. Before playing the interview, I want to give you some context. So before going into the interview, Laura suspected that his first murder wasn't actually his first murder, that it was most likely one of his lasts, considering it was so brutal. To Laura, brutality is evidence that he had done this before, and the decline of brutality, plus the cooking of the body parts, shows both a decline and almost retirement of his killings, but also boredom. His crimes actually got less violent as time went on, so they started with things like him dismembering bodies, but then it kind of slowed down, and she thought this was the end of his criminal career. One of the main reasons that Laura suspected this is because Wayne severed a victim's head, and she believes that is a progressive act and not typically an initial act. But Laura, I love you, but I beg to differ, because even though these cases are much different, both Lucas Magnotta and even Jodi Arias slit the throats, decapitated their first and only victims. So each killer's mind, their actions, their motives are different in that respect. And the fact that fear sets in and you're not familiar with what to do leads me to believe that anything is possible the first time, even drastic measures to discard the body thereafter. And Wayne says that his killings got less intense as he finished his career. So now let me go ahead without further ado. I know you've been waiting a long time. This is the interview between Laura Brand and Wayne Adam Ford.
Are the victims found? Well, it's a mystery.
I never found the head of the first one they got me for.
Really?
No.
I think there are more bodies out there.
I know. A lot of people do.
Here's why I think there is. All right, the first head of the victim was never found.
Right.
So obviously decapitation and the cutting off of the breast, the post-mortem mutilation, that doesn't just develop overnight. You know, that's a progression that goes far.
Yeah.
So to say like that was the first victim and it was only those 4 would be a real stretch. Not that it's impossible, but that's a progression that usually takes a while to develop. I think that was towards the end of it. Like that was the end of your career.
It sure looks like it.
What strikes me as odd is how calm and even jovial Wayne is talking about things. Like he severed a breast. Like that's sickening.
So I was walking down the street minding my own business, right?
Oh, and somebody just planted a human breast in your pocket?
I know.
That's what happened?
And then I gave it to the cops. What's a good citizen supposed to do?
Oh, that makes perfect sense. It all makes sense now.
I know. Now, don't you see? Now I've got all the way here. I'm totally a good Samaritan.
And this is just an observation. I noticed that Laura was also kind of talking so nonchalantly, and it kind of bothered me at first, but then I realized this was a way for her to gain the killer's trust and to build rapport. So I forgive you. This clip is also interesting to me because he says he's a Christian. He says he believes in God and Jesus, and he reads the Bible, and he had the Bible on tape when he was arrested. He says he doesn't justify what he did, but he says it's about being a Christian, but not a very good Christian.
If you read the Bible, the most important thing is to love God with all your heart and all your soul. That's the most important commandment. It isn't murder like most people think.
Now, how do you are Catholic, right? You do read the Bible and you're right?
No, I'm just a Christian. I'm just a Christian, not a Catholic.
But you believe
very close.
You believe in God and you believe in Jesus Christ and the Bible and
Absolutely. As a matter of fact, when they caught me, I had not only did I have the Bible, but I had the whole Bible on tape. You know, it was like 180 tapes when I was out in the wilderness.
So how do you, like, in your mind, how do you justify "thou shalt not murder" when you with your faith?
Yeah. No, you can't really justify that. It's a matter of being a Christian, just not a very good one.
Yeah.
You know?
And then this is what's really interesting, and you have to watch this clip several times to kind of, I did, to kind of understand what he's saying here.
Finally, I realized if I would have done everything the Bible said in the first place, I never would have ended up here. People wouldn't have got hurt. I would have had faith in something other than women, which tend to let you down. You know, right when stuff is at its worst, women leave.
He said if he had done as the Bible instructs, he wouldn't have done any of this. Instead, he put his faith in women, and they let him down. Wayne said they tend to let you down when stuff is at the worst, and that they're the first rats to jump off a sinking ship. He mentions that the Bible started with Adam and Eve was the original sinner, and that some things never change.
So
they're the first rats that jump off a sinking ship.
You know, it's funny because I talk to so many SKs, and they always say to me, it always goes back to a woman being wronged by a woman. That always seems to be, yeah.
Well,
and
have you ever read the Bible? That's the way it started too. It's been going like that ever since.
I'm going to link the entire interview below, so you should definitely listen to that. And closing out, there is another piece of footage I just have to show you because Laura wasn't the only woman that was interested in talking to Wayne. The sheer absurdity and irony in this final thing is laughable to me. There is a breast enlargement pill model. Yes, you heard that correctly. Her name was Victoria Redstall. She was 31 years old at the time.
Her name is Victoria Redstall, and she is obsessed with serial killers, no question about it.
She develops this fascination with Wayne. She ends up meeting with him. They end up getting into this close friendship. And I'm never sure whether these women actually do like these killers or if they're just doing this for shock value and their 15 minutes of fame. But either way, Ford is 44 at the time, and he agrees to star in a documentary that she's allegedly making. She explains that there's this close bond that has been developing between them. And like many women that think they can change men, sorry girls, she said she's not like the women that he killed. She's different, and that's why she's not bothered about it. He's a changed man. Are you serious? But it really seems so amateur, so cheesy, makes me laugh that I can't possibly take this seriously, and I really think that this was just an excuse to get close to a serial killer.
Find the secret locations that Wayne had provided for me in the maps he'd smuggled out of the jail months earlier.
A lot of people believe this was just a publicity stunt. Her career wasn't going anywhere, wasn't getting off the ground. I wonder why. And then Wayne is trying to make it seem like this isn't even true because clearly he wants Victoria to think he's this good guy, like he has any chance of making anything more happen with that relationship.
I blacked out during the killing.
In another play for attention, Victoria says on August 19th that she's going to search for the missing head of Ford's first victim, the one that was never recovered. And according to one publication, Victoria is laughing while she's referring to this as going headhunting.
Wayne, can you hear me? We're at the Mad River right this very second.
Wow, maybe they are a match. In closing, I just have one more observation. In this documentary, one thing I did find extremely interesting is that Wayne said a serial killer and a serial murderer are not the same thing, and I've never heard that before. And it's quite interesting because he admits when asked that he is indeed a serial killer.
The fact is a serial killer and a serial murderer might not be the same thing. I told you I'm a serial killer.
If you're not following, which I'm sure you are, he's saying that none of these were intentional, so he's not a murderer. He did the act of killing, so he's indeed a serial killer. And I honestly see no difference. Thank you for watching. Thank you for supporting me. Don't forget to check out Hunt a Killer. I'm leaving all the information below, as well as a link so that you can possibly play with me. Thanks so much for watching. I will see you in my next video. Bye.